that reflects an asymmetrical discussion between myself and a member of the audience that in fact transpired over many, many years. So I'm aware I've been a significant influence in this young man's life. I'm aware I am going to continue to be a significant influence in his life, even in my silence. Like, even if I did not read and reply to his email, even if I did not record this live stream, even if I decided to walk away from YouTube forever now, leaving only the videos I've made in the past, leaving the books I've already written and published, right? My silence would be just as significant in his life as anything I could possibly say. Now, I haven't asked this young man's age. In general, I don't pry. You will notice. And many of you have had conversations with me. But in the opening of this email I'm going to read out to you, he's reflecting on the influence of reading Plato, the philosophy of Plato in his life, and then how things had changed 5 years later. So we can reasonably suppose that this is now a young man in his mid-20s. I do not boast when I say that I hear from longtime viewers of the channel that they had expectations for the type of intellectual they would meet in university created by watching YouTube videos on this channel, by watching my live streams, and to some extent now reading my essays, reading blog posts, or reading the books I've written. And many young men, it's always men, it's never women, they tell me that they were really prepared for, a certain kind of seriousness about the meaning of life and for a certain kind of rough and tumble conflict, across ideological divisions for the sake of the meaning of life, for the sake of taking life seriously. They had this preparation for my YouTube channel, and then they showed up on campus, and guess what? None of their university professors can give a lecture like Asl Mazard. None of them can even do Q&A. Like, none of them can even answer questions. And that, on the contrary, they're finding their professors are nothing but brittle bureaucrats. Now, my own experience, which is not the topic of this video, was that my university professors were quite pathetic figures when compared to high school teachers. High school teachers were people who had, to some extent, gotten out and lived. And it's not just that the university professors were pitiable from my perspective. Very often, my university professors were asking me to pity them. It was rather like talking to a drowning man who had very little to say for himself, but can't you see, all I can do is just barely keep my head above water here. What more do you expect from me? So anyway, the young man who sent me this email, in some ways, he's extraordinary. But I have to tell you, I've been playing this role in other men's intellectual lives for a long time now. And in some ways, he's typical. So, his most recent message to me, dated April 19th, begins, quote, "First of all, I'd like to say that I've watched your 2 videos that mention our email correspondence, and I've taken a look at the blog. I'd like to thank you for the detailed reply, even if I didn't get the answer I was looking for. What you've given me will probably do me more good. At age 17, I started reading Plato, and within 5 years, I had read the extant works of Plato, Xenophon, and many other Greek and to a lesser extent Roman philosophers. I even wrote a few short Socratic dialogues of my own." Now, there's a nice coincidence here. I very recently mentioned in a live stream, a live stream that he hadn't seen when he wrote this email, that it would take about 5 years to really master the corpus of Platonic dialogues. So I don't think he's mimicking my estimate. if you're familiar with that literature, I just warned, it came up as an example in passing, in contrast to how little people learn in a university course that supposes to introduce you to Plato. It's like, well, we're talking about, investing like 5 years of your life here. Now, of course, it's a question of how much else you're doing during those 5 years. But I thought that was funny. I wrote back to him right away saying, "Oh, this is hilarious. I just made a video, whatever, a few minutes ago or something, And I had the same estimate that it really does take about 5 years." Okay, so I continue. Quote, "The philosophy of Socrates really did change my life in ways that I never could have been prepared for. The unexamined life, virtue, the meaning of the good, the meaning of friendship, etc. These were things I had never encountered as a video game playing, anime watching teenager. These seemed to me things that, likewise, no adult in my life had ever come into contact with." Um, this already is an interesting contrast to my own experience, my first encounter with the literature of Plato. I felt disgusted and enraged by Plato's writing. I can remember, this was my first year of university, it was just my first few months on the university campus, openly saying that I utterly despised Plato. I felt like the dialogues of Plato were everything I was born to rebel against. So I responded very, very negatively to the literature of Plato. It is significant that I'd already read some chunks of Plutarch's Lives. Now, if you know how enormous the page count is for Plutarch's Lives, regarded as one book, it's it's not surprising. I said I'd read some chunks. I did not read it from cover to cover, but I read it partly just focusing on names I recognized from history. Oh, I know who Julius Caesar is. Okay, I'll read the chapter about Julius Caesar. That sort of thing, from here to there. But my expectation for what the philosophy of Plato should contain, when I first encountered it at that age, I think on the one hand, it was based on reading Plutarch's Lives, reasonably enough. And on the other hand, we're definitely talking about Buddhist philosophy. I was already familiar with Buddhist philosophy, in English translation, of course, with the cherry picking that goes into the production of English language sources of Buddhism. But nevertheless, that gave me a sort of solid example of philosophy taking itself seriously. And philosophy that's very much framed in a way where it's presented to young men saying, hey, do you want to know what it means to be a man? And to some extent, do you want to know what it means to be a samurai? Some of that's built into that. So, in part, in contrast to those expectations that were established for me, I was utterly disgusted by the literature left behind by Plato, so the corpus of Socratic dialogues, so on and so forth. And what little appreciation I have for them, I started to develop later in retrospect. I'll say a bit more about that as this video goes on. Okay, so I continue reading his email. But even at age 17, for as many eureka moments as I had reading the philosophy of Socrates, I can equally remember myself almost shaking several books in rage at some of the utterly baffling stupidity in those books. Shout out to Crito, not only a bafflingly stupid, but evil book. So Crito is one of the Socratic dialogues attributed to Plato. You will notice, by the way, I'm not terribly interested in the question of what is Plato and what is pseudo-Plato. They're traditionally considered to be written by Plato, so for the purposes of this live stream, at least, we just leave it at that. Okay, I continue. Quote, Socrates ate meat. He drank alcohol. He says of himself, I'm a sober vegan of 7 years, by the way, and was not only pro-slavery, but explicitly advocated that slaves should dutifully serve and have reverence for bad masters that cruelly beat them. Several of his students became tyrants that looted the state and oppressed and brutalized the people of Athens, their own little philosopher kings. I should perhaps embellish his wording here. He means they were acting out their own little fantasy of being a philosopher king. And of course, they don't live up to the title. Alcibiades betrayed his own people and then doubled down by backstabbing the Spartans and again changing sides. None of this is contrary to the philosophy of Socrates, Even a brief reading of Xenophon's Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, alongside the Republic of Plato, is enough for one to raise one's eyebrows at the striking similarity in the actual lived reality and history of Sparta as juxtaposed to the philosophy of Socrates. We can see the very direct and disastrous legacy of the philosophy of Socrates in the forms of his pupils, Alcibiades, Critias, and Theramenes. So, guys, if you don't know, I made YouTube videos about this years ago. I think there were two different YouTube videos on this channel, or on my channel, About Le Ciel. Some of you may be hearing this as a podcast or seeing it elsewhere. There are two different videos titled Socrates Must Die. But I have videos taking seriously the political legacy of Socrates. So what his political philosophy really was, what the impacts were, and the extent to which he basically was participating in a kind of attempted coup d'etat. I think coup d'etat is more accurate than revolution. But Socrates generally now is remembered as a counter-revolutionary rather than a revolutionary, and as someone who is anti-democracy rather than pro-democracy. But it's a complicated quilt. There are pro-democratic aspects to the philosophy of Socrates, but those are just a few patches in the quilt. I think we'll have to admit right away. When I have returned to reading Socrates as a fully grown man, and I'm remembering this at two very different stages of my life. I earned the gray hairs in this beard, by the way. I am old. I identify as old. I'm old enough to sleep with women half my age without causing a scandal, if you can imagine that. It has always been shocking to me, in retrospect, to discover and rediscover how much the philosophy of Socrates, how much the philosophy of Plato had influenced me. And very often when reading it, like when going back to rereading it as an old man, I can remember how I reacted to it the first time I read it, right? Which is when I was a boy. And I can remember hating it and rebelling against it, being contemptuous of it and condemning it. Not least of all because of slavery. And the significance of slavery in this literature is, for me as a young man, was tremendous. How can anyone be so stupid and fatuous? How could they have this attitude? So on and so forth. But this is not the only issue. Certainly religion, broadly speaking. It's utterly bizarre to me the extent to which 21st century people lie to themselves with the clear religious message and clear religious preaching that Socrates provides in these dialogues. And those are, in many cases, the only portions of the dialogue that are not comedic. The bulk of the text is always comedy. The bulk of the text is joking around. But then at some point, sooner or later, in most of these dialogues, tone shifts. And Socrates says to you very seriously, okay, now we're going to talk about the afterlife. Now we're going to talk about reincarnation and the religious morals of the story. So this is true of many dialogues, perhaps all of the most unpopular dialogues, but a few of the popular ones as well. So to me, I mean, again, I was a young nihilist. I didn't yet describe myself as a nihilist at that time. This is utterly rebarbative, utterly risible, utterly deserving of contempt. But nevertheless, I now have the experience as an old man of going back to reread those texts and realizing how profoundly they influenced me. And there is probably nothing else like that. I was not influenced by Karl Marx in this way. Not at all. I think I was immune to the philosophy of Karl Marx when I read it. I was not influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche in this way. Not at all. But when you look at the twin dialogues, the statesman and the sophist, these are two dialogues, written by Plato, ostensibly expressing the philosophy of Socrates, etc. It's just appalling to me to see the extent to which my whole vocabulary, my whole concept of myself and who I am, and the life of the mind, being an intellectual, engaged in politics, this influenced everything in my life, even though I utterly hated it at the time. even though I scoffed at it and laughed at it. And again, what were my expectations of what philosophy should be? They were not based on Hegel, you know, but they did reflect just a few sources, certainly including Plutarch's Lives, for example, and certainly including my first contact with Buddhist philosophy. Now, let's say, Rinzai Zen, philosophy. Any of this stuff that's been, manhandled, very roughly transported into the English language with a lot of glorification and dishonesty along the way. Those texts, I mean, Taoist philosophy, talking about Tao Te Ching, Chuangzi, again, as very roughly rendered into English. Um, right away, you get direct, profound statements about the meaning of life and how you should live it and how this applies to you. Like, why this was written, who it was written for, what it's trying to tell you and preach to you. You can see the intentions of the author, and you can sort of feel out the fork in the road in the darkness in front of you. Like, you can realize, again, whether it's Zen Buddhism or Taoism, very broadly speaking, again, as available in English, right? You can feel out that fork in the road in front of you. It's like, okay, I can choose to live my life this way or that way. And the author of this text, or the authors plural, the people who contributed to writing this, religious philosophy from the Far East, this is what they wanted me to choose. They're saying, take this path, not that one. So you can respond to that in any way, right? But it gives you a clear sense of philosophical ideal that is utterly absent in these Platonic dialogues. So you get a Platonic dialogue, which is a bunch of homosexual men joking around about seducing teenage boys for hours. Like, and you're expected to, very respectfully read between the lines and assign, profundities to this, overtly ridiculous text. This is the Platonic corpus of dialogues as we have it. Now, I just want to briefly digress here. Not everything is about sex, but what if we had a culture that instead worshipped Tacitus? I don't worship Tacitus with them. But, what if the place of unique importance currently assigned to Socrates, as his philosophy was recorded and interpreted by Plato, what if instead that position had been given to Tacitus, Appian, Sallust, the other historians of ancient Rome? There's a very simple sense in which absolutely everything would be different. In my own experience of life in the last 2 years of high school and say the first 2 years of university would be utterly different. And that includes matters of sexuality, frankly. It really does. There's a lot of philosophizing about sex in all of these sources, right? But also, of course, violence and duty and honor and obligation and war, what it means to be a man. Again, the East Asian sources I've alluded to, they're also full of toxic masculinity, right? As I say, there's a lot of material about what it means to be a samurai, whether it's Japanese sources or Chinese sources, frankly. And, certainly, I won't go on and on, right? I think what's most terrifying is that when you look at the sort of process and product of education for the tiny minority of us, because we choose ourselves, the tiny minority of us who choose to take life seriously and read philosophy in our youth in this way, obviously the vast majority, like just whatever classroom you can remember being in, look to your left, look to your right. Was anyone else reading Plato but you? Even in my classes about Plato, I took one 400 level course on Plato, and I was literally the only person in the class who read the book. I've told that story before. Some of you may not believe me, but trust me, in that class, I was the only student who even did the assigned readings. I went above and beyond. I did more reading than that. And I remember talking about it with the professor, but it was painfully obvious in each and every class. None of the other students even did the minimum required readings. That was Plato. That was just Plato. Okay, but anyway, that's university days. If you're talking about high school, look to your left, look to your right. Who else here is reading Plato or Socrates or any of this sort of thing? But anyway, for the small minority of us, the self-selecting minority, you take life seriously and reach out for philosophy, right? There is this terrifying sense in which the education we receive seems carefully planned. But we all know it's the result of this sort of, entropy. This process of cultural entropy. People have ended up having tremendous respect for Shakespeare. Ask them why, nobody knows why. So Shakespeare alone is considered a great man, a great author, and even of philosophical importance and political importance. Not Dryden. John Dryden loses. Who really is worth reading or who's important for young men specifically to read at this stage of their development? Nobody's put any thought into it. It's just sort of how the cookie crumbled, right? Almost at random, Shakespeare has ended up being this uniquely respected and esteemed figure. And likewise, out of the whole literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, gather them together into one basket, it really is Plato alone. It's Plato's version of Socrates that everyone is supposed to respect, especially this terrible book, Plato's Republic, right? Is of this enormous significance. And then again, the other winners of this sort of very disorganized culture war, suppose you could call an endless series of cultural skirmishes. The next winners are then Nietzsche and Marx. These are the authors. But just say, it didn't have to be this way. Nobody planned it. Nobody made these decisions. Nobody decided, this is more important than Tacitus. Right? Now, again, by the way, I'm not the biggest fan of Tacitus. You've probably guessed, I'm not the biggest fan of Shakespeare. I'm just putting this forward as a possible contrast, right? We could live in a world where instead it is Tacitus who's worshipped, not Plato, and where people rather look down their nose at Plato, and instead it's the historians of ancient Rome, people like Tacitus, and including Tacitus, and especially Tacitus, that everyone worships. Again, I guess there's no point in listing off other examples, but you guys know I just recently spent a lot of time with Ovid. It would have been very unlikely to be Ovid, if you insist, however you prefer to pronounce these names. I reserve my snobbery for languages more exotic than ancient Latin when it comes to pronunciation. How indeed to pronounce Julius Caesar in the 21st century. One of the major reasons why people are uncomfortable with Ovid is sexual, right? Just if we're being honest. So to say Ovid is unlikely to beat Tacitus, partly for these reasons. Anyway, okay. At age 17, right, you encounter this bookshelf full of seemingly important sources competing for your attention. And they're very often presented to you as if there were some self-evident reason that nobody is allowed to dispute or debate as to why this book is important and some other book isn't, right? How did we end up with this set of priorities? How do we end up acknowledging the genius and importance of some names in that bookshelf and not others, right? Now, inevitably, if you live long enough in life, you'll wise up, right? I mean, whether that's at age 17 or age 27 or age 37, at some point you question the construction of the curriculum, how we came to live with these assumptions. But it's a terrible struggle back at age 17. Anyone can read Plato's Republic and say, to paraphrase my viewer here who sent me this email, this is both an incredibly stupid and an incredibly evil book. That it doesn't take a genius. But then much more terrifying questions come next. Why? Why is it this book? Why is this the one book I'm supposed to read Why is it just these few names, like Plato and Shakespeare, that have this overwhelming, overweening, definitive cultural importance? Why? Who decides? I decide. You decide. It's a decision each generation has to make for itself. It's a decision you have to make here and now. And as this young man writing to me reflects, he's now horrified to look back and realize how much these books influenced him. At least he read books at all. I'm surrounded by people here who've never read a book in their lives, some of whom are extremely sexually attractive, some of whom are incredibly good-looking women who compel me to question whether or not I want to settle down and raise children with them. You realize this is not a totally abstract reflection on feminine virtue in the 21st century. I've lately been meeting and interviewing and being interviewed by very attractive people who've never read a book in their lives. Hopefully they don't watch this video. This is a great video for me to share with one of those women in between the first date and the second date. Now that I think about it. In Laos, there were maybe 2 or 3 categories of people. There were people who were completely uncontaminated by formal education. It's one of the remarkable things about living in Laos at the time when I lived there. I assume with each passing decade this is less and less true. But you could meet people who had really grown up and really lived their whole lives without formal education, without any classroom experience whatsoever. They lived on a farm. They lived in, some of them, if you're talking about older people, lived in conditions of civil war, privation, no access to education, aside from their parents, that kind of thing, but no formal classroom education. One category. Then there's a second category of people who had access to elite communist education. People who grew up being taught to worship Karl Marx in the Lao language. I've mentioned this many times before, so this probably was an obscure tidbit of knowledge before I started broadcasting on my YouTube channel. But most of those people in Laos did not believe Lenin and Karl Marx were 2 different people. They thought they were one person called Lenin Ma. Thought that was one man, Lenin and Marx. And they read the philosophy of Lenin Ma as if this were written by one person. I'm not joking. So that was a second category of people who were brainwashed by communist propaganda and communist literature and communist philosophy and never grew out of it, never overcame it, right? And then the third category of people were those who were wise enough or clever enough to be disillusioned. Those who graduated into nihilism. Those who could recognize Marxism for the sham that it was. Who could see through the bullshit, what was being presented. But in that society at that time, right, the philosophy that was being presented to them as elite, right, a 17-year-old boy growing up in that society who takes life seriously and reaches out for philosophy. In that society at that time, they would reach out for Lenin Ma, Marxist Leninism, for that philosophy. And they would be given a whole vocabulary to think about history and politics and economics. They'd be given a set of questions and answers about the meaning of life, right? So it's not all bad. But the necessary next step is to reject it. And then at some point, the rejection of the philosophy becomes a philosophy unto itself. You become a philosopher in your own right, and thus, therefore, a nihilist. You know, the Pope does not believe in the papacy. Peasants do. Peasants believe in the Pope. The Pope himself cannot believe in popery. It's impossible. In the same sense, when you become a philosopher, by the same token, you have already become a nihilist. It has already become impossible for you to believe in the sensorium of seemingly meaningful things that the peasants believe in, that the followers of philosophy believe in the same sense that the Pope can never have the simple faith of the peasantry. And the Pope goes on blessing them without believing in his own blessings. He heals them without believing in his own power to heal anyone. Right? So that's what it is to be a philosopher. That's what it is to be a nihilist. And it doesn't matter if nobody follows you. It's a weakness. Who has need for followers? Look, I don't know how young this man is, but I'm sure he can already feel it. After a certain point in your life, what need do you have to be understood, to be appreciated, to be loved? You grow out of these things. It's childish. And it may be the most meaningful thing to you when you are a child. It may be the most meaningful thing to you when you're halfway between being a child and being an adult. You may have an intense need to be loved, to be appreciated, to be understood. You may. But live long enough and it becomes a laughing matter. You know, again, what need do I have for popery? In my ermine and my mail, with my mitre and my dunce's cap. All right. I continue to read this email. We left off when he says, you can see the very direct and disastrous legacy of the philosophy of Socrates in the forms of his pupils, Alcibiades, Critias, and Theramenes. This shouldn't be a mystery to anyone. It's very, very explicit in the text. And the fact that the vast majority of the sources we have on Socrates are quite frankly propaganda. And even these extremely biased sources reveal this evil should only have us ask more questions. Sorry, I think I had the emphasis on the wrong syllable there when reading that last sentence. But I'm sure you get the point. The problem with propaganda as a concept is that it presumes premeditated intent. It presumes that there's an objective, right? Even if you're just talking about advertising for tourism, you can have propaganda that promotes tourism, but there is an objective. There is something the government is promoting or whoever is paying for the propaganda. Who do you think? I mean, this is the tragedy of our civilization. And we are just as heavily propagandized as the people of communist China, right? But it's all freelance, amorphous, aimless propaganda. There is no purpose. There is no objective. And a large part of the disintegration of our society, when compared to communist China, is a result of exactly that. Right? So anyway, I'm not finding fault in order to be froward. I think it's useful for the younger man sitting with this email. It's useful for people in the audience just to think about that. It's easy to blame propaganda for the way in which Socrates is misrepresented in our culture. It's easy to blame propaganda for the way Plato is misrepresented. But it's not propaganda at all, is it? Right? Not in the same sense that the structure of education and philosophy in communist China today really is the result of propaganda. Okay. Quote, the unquestioned reverence of young men on YouTube for Socrates is one thing. Yes. Great example of freelance propaganda. This is totally decentralized, right? Totally freelance. There's no equivalent to the Communist Party of China controlling these YouTubers. Yeah. All right. The unquestioned reverence of young men on YouTube for Socrates is one thing. It's disappointing. The unquestioned reverence of the old gray-haired or balding men who have been studying the philosophy of Socrates for the past 20, 30, or 40 years and couldn't see what even I as a teen could see in those texts is disgusting. Period. Harsh but true. Period. Look, getting older is not getting wiser. There is no fool like an old fool. One of my friends just wrote to me about Richard Dawkins. Some very stupid things he said. Richard Dawkins is a very elderly man now, still clinging on to this life. I'm sure soon enough there will be parades in the street, you know, and there will be a national holiday declared when he dies, but he's not dead yet. And you know, I just had to say to him, look, honestly, look, we all have to face up to the extent to which Richard Dawkins is just a moron. Richard Dawkins is just incredibly stupid. And it's hard. Why? It's hard because we all respond with a certain degree of respect and veneration and wonder and amazement when we see sheep or goats butting heads on the side of a mountain. Sheep or goats rutting, competing, fighting each other, figuring out who has the best pair of horns when they clash on the fields. And I've been there and seen that in real life. And it is spectacular. And it is breathtaking. And that is what people like Richard Dawkins do with their intellect. But that's not what we should be impressed by. Okay, the spectacle of cashmere goats fighting in the fields, fighting on the sides of the mountain, that is ultimately just behavior in accordance with nature. Right? That is unfolding in the shadow of millions of years of evolution. What we should be impressed by, what we should take seriously, is when we see the intellect used to rise up above nature, to negate nature. That's one of many reasons why veganism is of such tremendous importance. It's one of many reasons why sobriety is of such tremendous importance, because we are using our intellect to do something that is, in a very important sense, contrary to nature, contrary to the animal impulses produced by millions of years of evolution. Oh, so here's a question from the audience. What do you think is the best method to learn a new language? For example, the Thai language. Well, you know, I have a separate YouTube channel devoted to this subject. I'm currently uploading most actively on About Ciel, and then my other channel, Aizal Mazard Monolingual Polyglot. If you just search for Monolingual Polyglot, you'll find it, if you can't spell my name. And those materials are also being uploaded as podcasts currently, if you want, if that's more convenient for me in that way. So I'm very happy to discuss those matters, but it's not the subject of today's video. You know, I'll say this. The best method to learn a new language is first to know the meaning of life, and then to understand how that language fits into your own process of living a more meaningful life. And that will motivate you, and that will reward you at every step along the way. Okay, I continue reading this email. So he has one sentence here, joking as an aside, like, I don't know, this Socrates guy kind of seems evil, bro. Ha ha. Quote, despite this, Socrates was and still is a major part of my life. Reading those books, many twice or even 3 times, writing my own dialogues, reading secondary texts, and even briefly considering studying ancient Greek. It changed me, bro. And it fucked me up, too. Now, again, imagine if you'd been born in Laos, imagine if you'd been born in Vietnam, imagine if you'd been born in Cuba. Instead, it would have been Marxism that had this, some form of Marxist philosophy that you then would have had to learn to overcome and discard. Quote, I devoted years of my life to studying the philosophy of Socrates and the philosophy and history of the classical Greco-Roman world more broadly, which included language study. I have regrets. I really can see ways in which much of that work was meaningless, and I can see how it fucked me up. Part of me even wants to go back and reread all of those works again, just to try to untangle any preconceived notions or baggage that I picked up from those works and may still be carrying. Right. but you're also defining yourself in contradistinction to the culture you were born into, right? You're understanding who you are better precisely by negating the meanings that authority figures have tried to impress upon you, right? So there's, you use this word untangling. I understand what you mean, but you're untangling more than just that. You're untangling a major part of Western cultural tradition, Western civilization. And that would be true of someone studying Marxism in the same way. Marxism is worse, but Marxism does contain many important themes, like just what are we going to do about poverty, questions like that, right? And in the process of debunking Marxism, right, likewise, there is this sense in which steel sharpens steel, and you may become a more brilliant person. First by understanding Marxism, and then by overcoming it, eviscerating it. Okay, I'm skipping over one small paragraph here because he mentions where he's from, and I want to keep this anonymous. Quote, I looked into medieval Christianity and walked away in disgust. I looked into Marxism and the philosophy of Max Stirner, and again walked away in disgust. I say the last 5 years, but really in the past year or two, I've been wandering between different philosophies, trying to find something profound and failing. Anytime I see a glimmer of something, I look under the hood and most often find a pile of shit. That isn't to say there's absolutely nothing profound in the philosophy of Socrates, the philosophy of Tertullian, or the philosophy of Marx and Stirner. But I have absolutely no interest in spending the next 5 years of my life studying any of these guys. I don't have the endurance to sift through the shit to find the handful of pennies at the bottom. Right. What is the point of having a philosophy? Okay. We've been discussing the point of negating a philosophy. What if that is always and inevitably the purpose of the study of philosophy, is to liberate yourself from philosophy itself, right? Is to learn to live without having a philosophy through the study of philosophy. Now, the examples he's just mentioned, their historical significance is entirely in terms of, should be understood in terms of negation, the negation of what came before. Like Karl Marx, what he accomplished as a philosopher is only significant. The only positive significance is in terms of negating something that existed prior to Marx. Max Stirner, an extreme case, his whole philosophy is just negation of what came before. I think that's true of each and every one of these. And it's not for historical reasons or political reasons. It's not for national reasons. It's not for collectivist reasons. It's for personal reasons. It's because that is the significance of philosophy in the lives of each one of these men. Now, is the significance of philosophy entirely negative? No. There was a time in my life when all I wanted to do was write children's storybooks, write philosophical storybooks for children and get them illustrated and published so vegan parents could read these slightly profound and philosophical storybooks with their children. So for many, many years, that was my dream. And it's a dream I had to discard because of the madness and the malice of Melissa, the woman who was my partner during those years. And to be fair, my absolute top priority during those years was loving her, was building a future with her, a future that now I will never have. But she was my top priority, not the books, and I wanted to do it together with her. I wanted to become an author of illustrated children's storybooks, right? So that's an example of a purely positive use of philosophy. But, right, from an adult perspective, the philosophical ideas you're trading in there, they are very simple, right? Simplicity, doesn't necessarily entail shallowness. They can be both simple and profound, right? It's very limited what you can do positively with philosophy. And, I'm open to the criticism, by the way, that my own philosophy, taken seriously, begins to resemble a religion. Of course it does. Because the question is not what should we believe? The question is not what should we know? The question is how are we going to live? What does it mean to be a man? So inevitably, even the most nihilistic of philosophies becomes a kind of religion. All right. I continue reading this email. Quote, maybe my interest in Buddhism is really just disguised Orientalism. I'm ignorant enough of the religion, culture, and history of Buddhism in ancient India that I can fool myself into believing that it's different somehow. But, as I said, I can't sing and I'm not Billy Connolly, and I have to do something with the next 5 years of my life. So he then says, if not Pali, then what? If not Buddhism, then what? But he has already spelled out clearly the critique of his own position, right? He is reasoning this through in terms of substitution. There was something profound he wanted the philosophy of Socrates to be. And not finding it there, he now turns to Buddhist philosophy and says, you're next. Right? He has a set of assumptions. He has a set of expectations that he applied to the literature of ancient Greece, to a lesser extent ancient Rome, but it's mostly ancient Greece we've been talking about here. Right? Disappointed and crestfallen, he now turns to the literature of ancient Buddhism and asks it to play that same role, to live up to his expectations. Isn't it obvious that this can only lead to another round of disillusionment and disgust? That what you really need to do is engage in a critique of your own expectations, the assumptions that you have imposed on these texts. So even referring back to something I said about 30 minutes ago, very, very roughly, you heard me half jokingly, half seriously complain. These ancient texts written by Plato, pages and pages of gay men joking about seducing teenage boys. You're really expected to take this seriously as philosophy. Okay? But even in offering you that complaint, all I'm really doing is juxtaposing my expectations of what the text should be to what the text really is. Most of Shakespeare's work is crap. It's just meaningless entertainment. Okay, maybe there are a few little profound turns of phrase here and there peppering the text. Most of Shakespeare is sex and violence, kind of cheap thrills. A lot of what Shakespeare wrote was like a horror movie. And yeah, the comedy hasn't aged well, but horror and revenge and violence, kind of cheap thrills for the honor. Shakespeare is shallow, right? But again, if I complain about that, whence do these expectations come from? Shakespeare didn't promise you anything else. Plato didn't promise you anything else. Plato is a comedian. He's saying, look, bro, I'm just trying to write this delightful text about a bunch of gay men joking about their sex lives. He's recording that moment in his culture. And, obviously it is of some historical significance and cultural significance. You get to read about what it was like being a gay man in Athens at that time. The psychology and the sexual morality and how that culture operated, right? And slavery and sex slavery. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to learn. And it's horrifying, really. Okay? But Plato is in a position to say to you from beyond the grave, look, don't you come at me with your totally alien set of expectations. I never promised you a rose garden. I didn't promise you a philosophy that was meaningful to your life, that changes and informs you, and like that answers your questions, right? So now we can say this again with Shakespeare. Shakespeare can say, "Look, man, I just want to write these sonnets, these erotic sonnets, related, whatever his own agenda is." Shakespeare is just doing his own thing for his own purposes, his own motivations as an author. And now, when we're dealing with ancient Buddhist texts, as the next example, the interest and motivation of the author has nothing to do with your life, your set of expectations, right? So these people, the authors of the Pali Canon, the most ancient, most important texts in Buddhism, what I refer to as the core canon, you can read my articles about that. So the most important philosophical texts in Buddhism, right? These are people who had a kind of hallucinatory experience, a kind of dream, and their whole religious praxis is about coaching you so that you can have the same hallucinatory experience, you can have the same induced dream, guided meditative experience, right? And they are certain, they are just so certain that once you have this hallucination, the same way they do, your whole life will change, and you'll take on this social role of being a preacher for Buddhism the same way they did. Right? What was that dream? What was the big deal? Well, among other things, this was a culture where people were already conditioned to believe in reincarnation, a major topic for Socrates also, by the way, right? And you have these dreams that reveal your own former lives. And then looking forward to the future, you realize that it is in your power to cut off this cycle of reincarnation. And that this right now, this is your last life. This is your final life in this long sequence of reincarnation. Hot stuff. This inspired men to divorce their wives, give up the comforts of their home, and go out and live alone in a cave. That's the effect it had on people, this shocking revelation. And seeing also, by the way, the emptiness of your relation with your own son, or sons, plural. The meaninglessness of having many children, having many sons. They're less interested in having daughters for lamentable patriarchal reasons. The meaninglessness of owning many cows. All these things are linked to this hallucinatory experience, what Buddhists would prefer to call a meditative experience. Right? Built into this also, by the way, this sudden shift in worldview, is that the gods don't know anything you don't know. So Brahma and Indra are not particularly wise. And if you go and talk to them in this dreamlike hallucinatory state, you will find, you're surprised, they don't know anything you don't know. They are not any wiser than the Buddha, for example. So there are supernatural things in Buddhist cosmology, but there is no supernatural wisdom. There is no supernatural knowledge. Now, I experience lucid dreaming. I rarely bother anymore. If you've been lucid dreaming your whole life, you get bored of it, But, decades ago, my powers of dreaming were something that set me apart from other men. It's different. It's not an experience everyone has. Or some people have only had the experience of lucid dreaming a few times in their lives. Whereas I've had it thousands of times, right? The experience of lucid dreaming. If you experience lucid dreaming, you're dreaming and you're aware that it's a dream and you can control that it's a dream, right? You can talk about philosophy with the fictional characters you encounter in your dream. And of course, they don't know anything that you don't know because they are figments of your imagination. They're produced by your dreaming mind. So you can have some interesting dialogues about philosophy in your dream, or dialogues about religion. But of course, ultimately, this is a kind of echo chamber, right? You're having a conversation with yourself. People in the ancient Buddhist world did not realize that. They did not see their own dreaming that way or see their own, hallucinations that way. And by the way, there is no reason to think that the meditative experiences described are anything other than a dream. These probably were guys who exhausted themselves and sitting upright went from a meditative state into a dreaming state. It's that simple, right? And they've really been programming themselves to have a certain kind of dream and a certain kind of subject. Same with all of us. If you're very anxious about your situation at work, you have dreams about your situation at work. If when you're awake, you're really worked up about something, thinking about something, it'll show up in your dream. So in that same way, sooner or later, these guys lapse into a dream and they have this vivid encounter with the dream world. But Indra doesn't know anything you don't know when you have a dream and you go and talk to it. Indra is not particularly wise or profound, right? Brahma is not particularly wise or profound. And so this is also part of the sort of emptiness of the cosmology revealed to you by Buddhism. Okay? That's the agenda. So the people who produced this literature, for example, have no interest in liberating the slaves. They have no interest in changing the nature of kingship, political organization in ancient India. They have no interest in food. They have no interest in preaching you that you ought to be vegetarian or vegan. And, in that period in India, different ideas of vegetarianism and veganism were major philosophical soccer balls being kicked around, for different religions that today we would describe in retrospect as Hinduism and Jainism. But there were many, many different religious tendencies competing, and probably none of them could be described as Hinduism, but in retrospect, we group them together this way, right? But different ideas of vegetarian. The founding philosophers of Buddhism, the founding authors who produced the Pali Canon, they have no interest. They have no interest in creating a better world. So that's their whole agenda. All right? And that is the literature that you, so you meaning the author of this email, I should show off this really great sticker I've got on the back of my my phone here. Anyway, I wish I had more of those stickers, frankly. My other phones just advertise the fact that I'm vegan, but that one, there we get Medusa. Anyway, this fellow writing to me, he has this set of expectations. He wants a more meaningful life. He wants something profound and rewarding to come from the study of philosophy. He realizes now the ancient Greek world can't give it to him. In the investigation of language, he's never going to get it. And he says, okay, therefore, Pali. If not the study of Pali, if not the study of the ancient Pali Canon, what now, what next? Okay. So I resume reading the email. Quote, if not Pali, then what? If not Buddhism, then what? If I come out the other end and have no contemporaries and find myself discouraged with the religion and the philosophy of Buddhism, at least, as you put it so many times, I'll get to be me. I'll get to be the one sober vegan in this city who can read the Pali Canon and tell you why and how it's all bullshit, even if the only person I have to talk to is my own reflection. I hope this isn't the case. I'm not the cynical old man that you are. I probably have another good 2 decades of youthful optimism in me yet. He says, I'll try to get back to you in 5 years. You can find out if I became a crazy Buddhist in Tibet practicing tantric sex magic, or if I just fell through and didn't even learn the language in the first place. Hopefully, with your advice and warnings, I'll be able to find a middle path, as it were, and maintain some of that much vaunted Buddhist detachment in my study of Buddhism. But we'll have to see. Either you are learning a language for the people who speak it, or you are learning the language for the sake of the language. Think about that. It's disturbing in its implications when you're talking about a living language like Russian or Chinese, right? Are you learning Russian for the sake of the Russian people? Are you learning Russian for the sake of particular Russian people who live in the same city that you do? If not, are you learning Russian for the sake of the Russian language itself? And I'm excluding entirely here my overly familiar refrain that you should make these decisions on account of the better person you would want to be. Is there a better person you'd want to be 5 years from now who is fluent in Russian or fluent in Chinese or can read Pali? Because in this case, in this context, I think any preconception you may have of that kind is inevitably going to be revealed to be a delusion. Right? Okay. Ancient Latin. Nobody speaks ancient Latin. Nobody reads ancient Latin. Nobody talks ancient Latin. Only a couple losers on YouTube. These people are despicable. The golden axe people, as I call them. And the university professors are all losers too. These people with PhDs in this field. It's utterly contemptible. It's utterly despicable. You can't possibly justify learning ancient Latin for the sake of the people. Pali is even worse. You do not want to know. You do not want to look at the demimonde of people who claim they have reading comprehension of Pali and talk about it on YouTube, or claim they have reading comprehension of Pali and have PhDs and positions in universities where they get to lord their superiority over others. They get to inflict their opinions on hapless teenagers who can't really fight back. Right? So if you're learning ancient Latin, if you're learning ancient Pali, you can't even make that decision on the basis of the person you'd want to be. Because that's something you can't even envision. You can't imagine it. And if you think you can imagine it, you're delusional. Tragically. Right? I would compare this to people who use steroids. There are relatively few examples of this on YouTube or on the internet. But every so often, there is a young man who documents his experience using steroids, and he gets no positive results. So he takes all the health risks, he deals with all the health damage. And, like you look at the before and after and during pictures, and he kind of got a bit puffier and a bit uglier. Remember one guy, this is when I was still in high school, just talking about getting terrible acne from using steroids, Like some people get really negative effects, but some people make the choice, make the sacrifice, and they don't get the body of their dreams. And they're even able to look at the photographs and say, oh, look, I think I was more attractive before I started using these drugs. Like it's all negative, right? So yeah, you can imagine the better person you want to be through using steroids. And in the case of steroids, it's predictable in the sense that we're dealing with the hard sciences. This is biological science. The effects of steroids are known. The effects of reading the philosophy of Socrates are unknown. And this guy had the honesty to say it fucked him up. He was really talking about the way in which he feels damaged by the study of Socrates, by the study of Plato. Okay, well, you don't know how the study of Buddhism is going to damage you. You don't know how the study of the Pali language is going to damage you. If you look at this like a course of getting on steroids, you don't know what you're going to look like after you start using these drugs. And if you think you do, it's a delusion, right? So either the language is worth learning for the sake of other people, or you are making the decision that you want to learn the language for the sake of the language itself. Even this seemingly simple statement he made. Well, by the way, I'm in a privileged position to make this statement about Buddhist literature, right? But he hasn't done the work yet, so we can't say this. The sense that there is something profound to be revealed by working on the primary source, by dealing with the gap between the English translation and the original ancient Pali. This is something I know about. I've been through that experience. Yeah. Um, if you feel so certain that there's something meaningful, there's something profound, there's something rewarding on the other side of that transition, you think you know what will be revealed. You may even think it because you read my articles, you read my past work, right? You're wrong. You're delusional in the same sense as the steroid user is wrong and delusional. Like you have a definite sense of what you want the results of the steroids to be, and then you're going to stumble into it and find out what you really get. And you're going to deal with the damage. You're going to deal with the opportunity cost and the harm that's done. Um, I used to be married to an anthropologist, and a lot of what makes reading the Pali Canon rewarding and dealing with the original ancient language and the gap with the English is anthropological in nature. Like you learn things about how marriage worked in ancient India. You learn things about attitudes towards war and soldiers. This kind of cultural study, piece by piece, you start to get a sense for, you start to get a feeling for how that culture worked. You know, and nobody studies Buddhist philosophy for that reason. And again, I got to give credit to my ex-wife, my first wife. If I hadn't fallen in love with her, would I have found that rewarding? Like, what did I really enjoy about that anthropological aspect of studying ancient Buddhism and ancient India and studying Pali? Maybe what I enjoyed about it was sitting down to eat dinner with my wife and talk about those things there because she was really interested in it. And she could offer contrasting examples like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting because in this period of time in China, this is how there was a marriage ceremony that was in some ways different or some ways similar. And here's an anecdote from Papua New Guinea. Her background in anthropology, to some extent, she had examples from around the world from different cultures because that's what anthropologists do. That's what they read about and talk about, right? So, like the study of ancient Pali made sense within that marriage, within the life I was living, flying around the world, meeting other intellectuals, even if a lot of them were pseudo intellectuals and were terrible people, still meeting other intellectuals connected to anthropology, meeting people who cared about the history and politics of Asia, cared about culture and even fine arts and museology in Asia, right? And people who cared about Buddhism, even if they didn't really know what it was they cared about. So look, I kind of had this wonderful jet-setting life with my first wife, flying around the world and encountering these people. And some of those encounters were very tense and very nasty. There's a lot of conflict, you know. Um, and whether or not I learned anything from the conflict is debatable. Because a lot of the times, you're going into those conversations, and I'm the one who has all the cards. The other person has a PhD in anthropology, but they're totally ignorant. You know, is what it is. But yeah, I mean, I heard, I just want to, again, you guys may not know this, but you may. Like when I was in Cambodia, I heard several papers presented by people with PhDs in anthropology in person, face to face, and then talked to the presenter and talked to other people at the event. So even in Cambodia, I had that kind of intellectual life, not just in Cambridge, England, not just in France, you know. And again, this gave me a set of expectations going into the vegan movement that I was similarly going to connect with and clash with other serious intellectuals, which in case you didn't know, never happened. Instead, I met people who were completely insane, like Aaron Janis, meet dried up old drug addicts and bodybuilders, these terrible, terrible people in the vegan movement. My experience with the vegan movement is nothing like that, unfortunately. Okay, so what does it mean to make the commitment to learn a language because of the other people who speak that language, right? And then what does it mean to make that commitment for the sake of the language itself? Because you feel this language is worth learning, period. For this young man, I'm assuming he's about 25, could be younger, could be 22, right? You feel so confident that the study of ancient Buddhism and the study of Pali as a language will be rewarding in the way that the study of ancient Greek was not. Okay, but how rewarding is it if we even just contrast it to Russian? Because you and I both know it will be less of a struggle, it will be less effort with a much greater reward if instead you buckle down and learn Russian now. And it may be true that there is nothing you want to read in Russian. I say this all the time. Part of my book, there's nothing I really want to read in French. Okay, not nothing, but still, you know what I mean? There isn't some predefined canon of philosophy that people say is of such tremendous significance, the way there is with the predefined cultural status of Plato, the predefined cultural status of Shakespeare, the predefined cultural status of Buddhist philosophy, right? It's not set out for us as this great intellectual mountain. But maybe that's the most rewarding thing of all, is to undertake the study of a language like Russian precisely because you don't know what will be meaningful about it yet. You don't know the ways in which it will challenge you and change you, and you don't know what the opportunities are. In contrast to your certain knowledge of what it is that Buddhist philosophy is supposed to bring into your life.